There we are. That's perfect. Welcome, everybody. America is all in. If you don't believe that, you're in the wrong room. And we are going to now have a discussion. Oh, yeah, we have to be careful. Half of them leave. No, I believe it. So my name's Andrew Steer. I'm the president and CEO of the Baseless Earth Fund, and it's a huge privilege to work with many of you in this room. We have a fabulous panel here. A group of the leading analytically smart NGOs have got together over the last few months to say, what do we really need to respond to the global stocktake? That's what we're discussing today. Now, one fact that you may not agree with, but I do, is that the Paris deal is actually working. You know, we tend to look at the stocktake as something that says we're failing. Well, we are failing. But when we set up the Paris deal in 2015, the reason that was so brilliant was that it knew you could not have a textbook approach where you allocate the right to emit carbon, and if you break the rules, you go to prison. We weren't in that kind of political situation. It set up a system of voluntary targets that we knew would not be ambitious enough in order to solve the problem. And we were right. They weren't ambitious enough, and no sensible person would have thought they would be ambitious enough because they were voluntary, and countries were new at this, and they weren't going to want to take risks that maybe could cost their economy and what have you. So they had various levels of ambition. And then the entire idea was, you would ratchet things up. And the hypothesis was, if you remember, that as the price of green technology, especially renewable energy, but electric cars and many other technologies, as the price of those came down, and as the seriousness of the problem went up, citizens and governments and corporations would realize there's time to move. That's why you'd raise the level of ambition, and 80% of countries have now come out with new NDCs. And one of the great objectives of this COP is to make sure that everybody raises ambition further in the next 2 years before the Brazil COP. So these are incredibly exciting times, and one of the most sort of interesting intellectual developments that's occurred in the last year or two, literally, has been a recognition of the importance of exponential change. We tend to look at indicators, and we tend to assume that the world operates in straight lines and smooth curves, whilst actually the way history works, especially when it comes to technology, is there's nothing linear about it. There will be kinks in the system. There will be hockey sticks in the system. And just as there are negative tipping points, which could prove disastrous, the melting ice, the Amazon dieback, and so on, so too there are amazing positive tipping points. On Wednesday, Kelly, you might tell people about this later on, there's going to be a very important report launched on tipping points. And that was precursored by the State of Climate Action, which came out last month, which basically looked at the 50-odd transitions that are required, and only one of them is on track out of 50, out of 40, I guess you looked at carefully. So on the one hand, it looks really depressing. On the other hand, there are these amazing tipping points, some of which, such as electric-like vehicles, have already been crossed. And so that's what we're sort of going to discuss here. We're going to discuss 5 sort of imperatives that need to drive decisions in the next 7 days. People say we have a decade. We actually have a week to make decisions. That's what the panel today is all about. I hope I got that right, Helen. Helen Mountford, President and CEO of the Climate Works Foundation, which is doing unbelievably wonderful work all around the world. Over to you.
Thank you so much, Andrew, and wonderful to be here with you. I'm going to call up our fabulous panel now, if I could. We've got Manish Bapna, President and CEO of NRDC. We've got Kate Levick, Associate Director, Sustainable Finance from E3G. Please come up and join us. Nat Keown, President, Center for Climate and Energy Solutions, C2ES. Marcin Mitchell, Senior Vice President for Climate Change, WWF. And I'm realizing we missed Melanie's name. Melanie Robinson, who is the Global Climate Program Director for WRI, which I have to say is a fabulous job and really wonderful to have you in that role now. Perfect, thank you. So as Andrew said, I mean, we want to look at 5 things that are just absolutely essential to get into the global stocktake here and ensure that we can really move forward to implement climate action seriously in the coming years, to really build on those positive tipping points, deliver on those, and then ramp up ambition as we go into COP30 in Brazil in 2025. We know that already we have seen progress. There's been significant progress since I first started going to COPs many years ago. In 2010, we were on track for a 4 to 5 degrees Celsius world. Now we're on track for something like 2.4 to 2.6 degrees Celsius. Far too much global warming, absolutely. Already we're seeing the devastating impacts on vulnerable communities around the world of where we are at much lower warming, and we can't go there. If we are able to deliver everything that countries and companies and others have committed, we'd be on 1.7 to 2.1 degrees Celsius, still too far. So we're looking at how do we actually address that? How do we build in, not just ramp up the energy transition and do that much faster? How do we build in what we need on adaptation and resilience, loss and damage, really shift and transform food systems and agriculture, and deliver the finance needed for all of this. So we're going to start with a first question to a couple of the colleagues on the panel, which is really, we are here because we need to pick up the pace and accelerate climate action, whether it's for mitigation, reducing emissions, or to help vulnerable communities with the transition and to build resilience. So I'm going to start with Melanie, if I can. Melanie, it'd be great if you could tell us, what do you think we need from the GST, the global stocktake, that can really help accelerate this action and inform the next round of NDCs? Over to you, Melanie.
Thanks very much, Helen. Yes, it is a wonderful job. Thank you for passing it on to me. So the global stocktake, as Andrew said, when it was set up, it was very clever because it's not just about backward looking and where have we got to and giving us a bit of a shake at what we've not achieved and some signals of where we can do things well, but it's also about what we need to do into the future. So it's a real opportunity here this week and next for the GST discussions to send a really clear signal about the next round of NDCs. And those are due in the first part of 2025. And for the next round of NDCs, they need to have a target for 2035, but we also want to see increased ambition for 2030. The second point here, though, is that we don't just want an emission reduction number. We need these NDCs to really get into what Andrew was talking about, which is that system transformation, the work that Kelly's been working on to look at how do you change whole systems, whole sectors. And these NDCs will have to get into that. And now this week, there's been some important declarations and commitments on that, which give us confidence that we might actually get to that system sectoral level. So they're declarations that we want to see them in the actual agreement, but they're declarations for the moment. More than 110 countries that have committed to treble renewable energy and double energy efficiency. More than 60 countries supporting subnational action and action by cities, and more than 130 countries that have signed up to the Sustainable and Resilient Food Systems Declaration. And in every single one of those declarations, what was really significant was they also said, and we will put this in our NDCs. So we've got some strong signals now that that next round of NDCs will really start thinking about system change alongside, of course, rapid shift away from fossil fuels that we're all looking for. My third point, Helen, on this, and to finish on this point, is that it's nice to have NDCs with good commitments, but of course, implementation is key. And we are now getting the phase where I strongly believe we need to support developing countries to help them take those NDCs and those NAPs and their biodiversity plans and actually bring those into the heart of their decision-making around key economic decisions and support countries to develop low carbon, climate resilient, nature positive, inclusive development plans so that they can really have the structural transformation that they need and back that with not just projects here and there, but programmatic finance, public, private, national, international finance to let them implement those NDCs so that ambition becomes a reality.
Thank you so much, Melanie, for that. Manish, let me sort of stick on this topic and pass over to you. What are the big strategies and policies, the opportunities you see to be implemented that can really help countries to achieve their national and subnational targets? How do we actually, that's fine. What are the big ones you'd emphasize now? Things have been shifting in recent years. What do you think are the big ones?
Great, thank you, Helen. And very much picking up on this point around implementation. And how do we think about implementation in ways that actually get the exponential change that we need to see? How do we approach those tipping points? And there's a couple of things I think worth mentioning. I just want to spend a moment just on narrative and then talk a little bit about what we're seeing kind of from countries all around the world in terms of how to actually advance climate NDC implementation in a serious way. On narrative, one of the interesting things is if you look at almost any country around the world, these are growth plans, they're development plans, they're jobs plans, they're prosperity plans. From the United States, right, the climate bill was called the Inflation Reduction Act. When you ask the president or the vice president about how they're going to be talking about this, they're talking about it in the terms of jobs. Yesterday, I was with the Climate Vulnerable Forum leadership. What they're developing, climate prosperity plans. Almost any country, irrespective of where you are, the narrative matters here. It is about a better growth. It is about better development, better livelihoods, good jobs. And I think that's incredibly important to think about how you sustain the political support for greater ambition. Now, as we think a little bit about different types of policy approaches, the thing that I think has become much more explicit in the last couple of years is green industrial policy. How many countries have kind of rediscovered the recognition that what happened back in the 90s in a number of countries around the world is actually happening here in the context of climate. And it's quite powerful. But we also know that there's only so much public money around. So you can jumpstart a lot of innovation, a lot of action on climate through public money. But we have to be thinking about carbon pricing. That's going to be an important part of the conversation today and increasingly important tomorrow. Kristalina Georgieva spoke about this quite eloquently earlier in the week. 23% of global emissions are covered by a carbon price of roughly $23, weighted average. We got to increase those numbers significantly because ultimately polluters have to pay. We also have seen, quite interestingly, strong efforts around rules and standards. It can't all be carrots, but with strong carrots, you can put in sticks to get the scale and the urgency and the pace that we need to see. And the other last point I would make is I've seen a lot of really interesting innovation around national targets and subnational competition. Think about India's 500 gigawatts renewables target. Different states competing for who's going to have the greater share. Think of China and early peaking on CO2. Provinces and cities clamoring to see who would be on the early peaking list. There's a level of healthy competition that can also be addressed through this. So in 2-3 minutes, trying to cover strategies on climate action around the world. But thank you, Helen.
It was just a small question, but thank you, and thank you for highlighting both some of what we're seeing now in terms of the green industrial policy opportunities, but also the importance of carbon pricing as well as regulations and what happens nationally and subnationally. Thank you. let us go to the second topic, which is one that's a particularly hot one here at COP these days, which is really about how we manage the just and equitable energy transition. And as noted, it really does need to include both the ramping up, the tripling of renewable energy, doubling of energy efficiency at least by 2030, and the phase out of fossil fuels. But this is under a lot of discussion and debate here. So as we look at this, I want to pass to a couple of the panelists to sort of give us some reflections. And Marcin, I'd love to start with you and just ask, what are the pathways that you see in terms of tripling our renewable energy capacity by 2030? And how do we do this in a way that is just for people and also helps protect nature?
Thank you. Is that on? Okay, great. Thank you. Well, so I'd like to actually build on Manisha's point about the narrative, right? I think we have not spent enough time actually bringing enough people along. This is a massive transformation. It's going to impact everybody's lives. And it's not just about regulations or carrots and sticks to businesses, et cetera. It's also about changing that feeling and that narrative to people and building the popular will to do this. So I think there are two main things. One, we need to combat, as NGOs, some of the excuses and the disinformation that we hear, right? So some of the things are that people really believe here is that it is the cost of, it's too expensive. We can't afford to do this, right? We can push it down the road because it's too expensive to do now. And we know that the cost of technology has fallen, exponentially, as which is Andrew's point, and it is competitive in most cases, and sometimes it is even, the lowest cost option. So we have no excuses on that. In the industrial world, financing is not a major barrier. Now, there are some short-term headwinds, right, with inflation and cost of capital, but in general, we've had now a decade of the financial world financing these type of things. So it is really possible. There are no excuses on that. In the developed and the global south, it's a little different, right? Cost of capital is high, but we're finally beginning to see, with the World Bank and other multilaterals and bilaterals, beginning to understand the role that they can play in buying down that cost of capital and really de-risking some of that thing so they can let private sector monies flow. So no excuses. The other thing that we hear is it's going to take lots and lots of land, and it's too disruptive. Again, we can't do this. And according to a report that was just released by BCG and WWF, which compared the two scenarios of accelerating renewable energy and business as usual, on this issue of land requirements, the accelerated renewable energy scenario is less than the business as usual scenario, even if you include the requirements for mining needed materials for renewable energy. So that is, the myth is that we can't afford it, we don't have enough land. There's also the opportunity with renewable energies to use brownfield coming from the agricultural sectors and repurpose, fossil fuel assets in terms of using that land. So again, no excuses. And then finally, I think for us, this is very important, is the impact on nature is too great, right? We hear that a lot. We hear that at the local level. We hear that at the international level. And it is something we need to be cognizant of. There will be impacts. We cannot do this without impacts. And I think all of us are going to have to get our heads around that. But it's the scale of the impact compared to the benefit of what we're doing. And just recently, the Audubon Society, right, who cares very much about bird populations, put out a report about the impact of offshore wind on the bird populations. And what they basically said is they debunked a lot of the myths of how strong that is going to impact. Just in terms of the top things that impact bird populations, offshore wind was not it, right? And then they also put out great information about how you can mitigate the worst impacts of offshore wind or onshore wind on bird populations. So we need more of us to be able to go out there, as with the credibility we have as environmental NGOs, and talk about that and say no excuses. And the second thing that we need to do is, this is on the narrative again, is build that social license to deploy renewable energy. So no matter where you live, whether it is in the industrialized countries or the global south, building infrastructure of this size and scale is going to impact you and in your neighborhoods, in your areas. And the communities are going to have something to say about it. They're going to feel some way about it. And we need to recognize that. We need to get much better at stakeholder engagement. Again, as NGOs, we're just really, I mean, some of us have done it for a long time, but we haven't done it at the scale and size that we need. And if we do not bring the communities along, we are going to have so much NIMBYism, pushback, fear, concern. So before we can even get to regulations and all the things, the technical things that we need to do, we will not have people with us. So we must focus on community benefits. Different communities will want different things. There's no one size fits all, although we can use the same processes to engage our stakeholders, right? And we can do that fast. So the NGOs in this room supporting this response, we must increase our work together, because not one of us can do this, to engage communities, to fight disinformation, and make sure we have this just transition. We shouldn't make the same mistakes we did with the fossil fuel era, and together we can build the momentum.
Thanks so much, Marcin, and I like the sort of focus on also no excuses, right? We have to tackle the narrative, we have to get that right, but also for us, there's no excuse for neglecting that focus on people and working together on a just transition, or allowing the nature and climate tensions to actually block what is needed. We need to work together to find those solutions. Thank you. Let me pass over to Nat. I mean, there are the two sides of this, right? There's the scaling up renewables and getting energy efficiency, and there's also the phasing out the bad, the phase out of fossil fuels. Tell us about where you see the opportunities to do both sides of these.
Thanks, and thanks to Marcin and WWF for hosting us and for putting this together. So I guess I want to make 3 points and try to build on much of what's been said already. The first goes back to where Andrew started off with the global stocktake, and with, oh, thanks, I won't run long that way. It goes back to where Andrew started off with the global stocktake, with the 7 days, and builds on what Melanie said. I think it's really important that we have a clear set of signals come out of the outcome on the global stocktake that provide guidance for where action can, where international action can be focused over the next year and can feed into the NDCs, as Melanie talked about, and as Manish talked about, can feed into the NDC. So what are the small set of things, right? That's why we're talking about a 5-point plan, not a 50-point plan or a 500-point plan. A handful of things, and I think one of them clearly needs to be the tripling renewable goal that Helen, you talked about. We've seen a lot of momentum behind that. 118 countries at this COP signing the pledge to triple renewable capacity while doubling energy efficiency. We saw the U.S. and China, while China wasn't one of the signatories, when the U.S. and China met at the APEC summit, their communique talked about tripling renewables. So I think there's a lot of momentum behind this, and it's really important that it gets reflected in the global stocktake, in the political outcome, and that becomes a focus for action next year, and then something that countries can look at, can use in informing how they ramp up their ambition in 2025, as Andrew talked about, as part of that 5-year ambition cycle. So that's the first piece. Really important to have this tripling renewables as part of a handful of signals that come out of the stocktake. I think the second point is, well, what is that going to take? And builds on some of what Marcin said and the narrative points I think that Manish said. I guess I would say what it's going to take, what's interesting and what makes it so well suited for a country, the 118 countries, and for a global stocktake outcome, is that every country, I think, has a role here to participate. In the U.S., Manish talked about the Inflation Reduction Act, putting massive amounts of money into supporting the deployment of renewables in the U.S. Also talked about what's happening in India and elsewhere. There's massive opportunity, as I think Marcin said, for renewables all over the world. We know the costs are falling, and so we know we have, as I think Marcin put it very well, there's no excuse. The costs are falling. Renewables are cheaper in most of the world, especially if we can unlock some of those, we can de-risk the capital and the capital flows, and we can unlock the finance. We can get to that tripling renewables. And we can do that in the next 7 years by 2030. And so then the third point is thinking about the incentives, to your question, Helen, the incentives that can also not only get the renewables going, but also help to accelerate the phase out of fossil, because it's not just adding the capacity that we want. We also need to be replacing the fossil fuel and phasing out fossil fire generation. And here's where I think incentives really matter. Manish talked about a carbon price. I think, of course, a carbon price would be, we already see it in much of the world, and that is a great way to correct the incentives. We also know we have to reverse the perverse incentives that we're putting on already, over $1 trillion in explicit fossil fuel subsidies already. And if you add in the implicit subsidies from not having carbon pricing, you get to $7 trillion. So we need to stop subsidizing the bad stuff. And I think we need to find innovative ways to finance the acceleration of renewables and the phase out of fossil fuel. And several of us were, Andrew and I were at an event yesterday that I think is an exciting step towards that idea of finding new sources. Many people in the room contributed to that, which is the Energy Transition Accelerator we launched or rolled out. First step yesterday, hope to launch it by Earth Day of 2024. Just one example among many of how to catalyze finance for that transition. So let me stop there.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Nat, and for highlighting all of those points and how we need to really move this forward, and what the incentives are that we are using and can do even more. I want to pass over now. We're going to focus a little bit on climate finance, which is often the elephant in the room. We know that we're not able to do this transition without sufficient finance, and we're always seeing gaps. There's more coming, private sector, more public, but it's limited. And we often hear reasons why we can't get more public. So I want to actually pass to Manish to start with a question about the public finance side. How do we actually get this moving? Is there funding? Are we able to do this? Or is it just too tight?
No, great. And maybe just connecting the dots a little bit here, because the ability to get an ambitious outcome in the next 7 days on the global stocktake will depend in no small part on credibility on financing packages for the developing world that will be needed to get the greater ambition in the next round of NDCs. So how do we get those more credible financing packages in place? A question to all of you. COVID, how much money was spent by G20 governments as a response to COVID globally? Does anyone have any? How much money was spent? It's exactly right. The person who sits in the front row knows the answer. $14 trillion, right? $200 billion has been spent on Ukraine, on aid to Ukraine, right? And yet we struggle to find the money that we need to find for climate. So just a few very quick thoughts on where we might be able to find some of that. I want to build on what Nat just said, the Energy Transition Accelerator. Corporate net zero commitments, potential money from the private sector. Design is absolutely critical to get right, as we know, but a lot of promise. Subsidies. You mentioned $1 trillion of subsidies last year for fossil fuel. $1 trillion for fossil fuel, $88 billion for renewable energy, right? How do we change that? We know the political economy is not an easy set of questions, but we need to get that right. If you look at carbon pricing, or if you look particularly at oil and gas, let's say we taxed oil and gas at just $6 a ton. That'd be $150 billion. And the latest US methane rule has an implicit price on carbon, don't tell anyone, of around $175.
We are still in.
We are still in, right? And if you look at, there's a lot of also innovation around aviation and shipping levies. There's a lot of opportunity here, but we know we need to have the political will to move on that. And that's what we need to see coming out of this COP if we're going to get an ambitious response to the GST.
Thank you. Thank you, Manish. And thank you so much for highlighting the importance and the opportunities there. We hear that there's not a lot of public funding, And yet there is quite a bit going to, in some cases, fossil fuel subsidies, exactly the wrong direction, counter to all we're trying to do on climate, and that absolutely must stop. Kate, I want to bring you in here. Really, you're focused on finance and you're looking at this. How do we actually do the broader package for what is needed to deliver all that we're putting into the GST? It's a big question, but over to you.
Yeah, thanks very much. And first of all, I'd just like to say how much I appreciate the invitation to speak and this esteemed panel. So thank you very much. I would like to take it back to, what was said really at the beginning of the event about sort of how clever the idea of the global stocktake is, that there's a sort of reality-based sense check, because sometimes in the world of the UNFCCC and the climate negotiations, I think we all know we can get quite far into bubbles that don't relate back to the real world at times. So going back and asking what's going on in the real world, are we actually where we need to be, is a very, very powerful thing to do. Now, in the UNFCCC negotiations context, we've all been thinking very hard and working hard towards this magic 100 billion number. And that's a really important number, the 100 billion. It came out of a very difficult time in the negotiations. It was a big, round number that galvanized people, brought people together, was highly ambitious, and really helped to keep momentum going, for the talks into future years. Of course, it has also become a bit of a millstone for a couple of reasons. One is it's actually proved extremely hard to reach, possibly harder than originally anticipated, and that's created all sorts of difficult dynamics in the negotiations in the last few years. The other reason is it's not enough. It's not enough to finance the global climate transition. So, a huge amount of stress and angst and pain being caused by this number that isn't even the right number in the first place. So what I think the global stocktake gives us an opportunity to do is to stand back and look at the whole financial system. I think about the third Paris goal, Article 2.1c, which effectively points towards aligning the financial and economic system to climate, what we call climate safety in E3G, a climate resilient world, a net zero world. And that creates some different conversations, and I think we are starting to see conversations in this COP context that are also in that broader context. Now, going back to negotiation tensions, again, we've many, many times seen these tensions between Paris Article 9, which is all about the climate finance that's badly needed and expected and hoped for by developing countries, and the Article 2.1c, which is much broader and sometimes is treated with some suspicion in terms of what people are trying to smuggle in under that banner and whether that actually mitigates against richer countries fulfilling their pledges. I think what we are starting to see, though, is a broader agenda around financial system reform. And that's been emerging in a lot of different places, in the G20, for example, and the G7, in the IMF meetings, and in the Paris summit this year that was announced at last COP by Macron and held, and really brought back together sort of global South countries and richer countries, and a whole load of different ideas on the table. So the question, for us has been partly, can that momentum be carried through into this COP? And can that conversation be picked up in this COP, potentially through the global stocktake, to enable us to think more broadly going forwards about what our next goal will be? And what will we all be working towards? What's the ultimate end goal we're trying to get to in terms of financing change, and how can we express that goal? Obviously, we're not quite there with the expressing the terms of the next goal, but I really do hope we make substantial progress in terms of how we reflect this broader systemic context in the global stocktake. So, at this COP, we have obviously seen a lot of big pledges. We've seen the UAE up the ante, and suddenly everyone's talking in terms of billions for various things in terms of millions. That's quite welcome. But we know that the number's much, much bigger than that, and we had some sobering, sort of additions to our knowledge of those big numbers today when the Stern-Songwe report version 2 was announced. And flicking through my notes here to where I've got their amazing stats. Hang on. Yeah, I just wanted to make sure, because people might not have had a chance, I suspect people have not had a chance to read the summary document of the Stern-Songwe report. So, they're talking about, by 2030, needing a 5-fold increase in concessional finance, including a tripling of MDB finance that comes through a reimagined role for MDBs, and a 15-fold increase in private finance to emerging markets and developing economies. In fact, I have a feeling that in the event itself, Nicholas Stern even says something higher, like 18 times. So these are very, very big numbers. This this indicates a financial system transformation and finding an awful lot of money. And if there's one theme that I've felt coming through, I will wind up from the COP discussions, particularly today on Finance Day, it's a real awareness of how big the challenge is, whatever the precise number is, and people having conversations about how to get there. Opening up fiscal space and addressing debt is understood to be absolutely key to this. I don't think there's any debate now about the need to change the way that MDBs work, and the conversation is very live now about giving them more capital, which, until quite recently was not on the table, and now suddenly that's what everybody's talking about. We're seeing propositions around tax and innovative ways of raising global taxation, as well as other sources of kind of non-conventional finance, if you like. Carbon credits still very much a live discussion. SDRs, of course, has been going for a while. I think, it's an unfolding conversation with a lot of ideas on the table right now, but I think the reason we're seeing that is because everybody's just getting to grips a bit with the scale of that finance challenge and trying to work out how we're going to do it.
Thank you, Kate. And actually, that's quite hopeful because we have been struggling with the 100 billion, as you've said. That's really been a point of contention. But we are seeing now momentum building for the. Thank you, Andrew. Bye. Through the reform of the MDBs and looking at other ways to actually get to that to those financing numbers. They are large and we're far off. So there's a lot to be done. Thank you. Let's go now to talking about adaptation and loss and damage. Absolutely essential as we see this year being the hottest year on record, which follows previous years, which were hotter and hotter. We've been really building this up. We're seeing the natural disasters impacting so many around the world with devastating effects, particularly on the most vulnerable communities and nations. So let me pass over to you, Nat. Again, one of the issues that was really very exciting on day one here was, of course, loss and damage with the agreement on how to move forward and operationalize the fund. And last I heard, almost 600 million in pledges to support it. So, Nat, over to you. What's working on loss and damage? What are we seeing? What more do we need to do?
Thanks. Well, let me actually make one point on adaptation as well, and then shift to loss and damage, because obviously they're both really critical and needed. And I think the point on adaptation would be building on what Kate just was talking about, finance and the need for new goals and so on. And I think actually adaptation is an area where there's an opportunity to start thinking about and articulating what is the global goal. And of course, the global goal on adaptation is an important aspect of work going on now. But I think, if you think back to the Framework Convention, right? Article 2 of the Framework Convention, avoidance of dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate, right? When that was stated, that was a very vague, high-level goal. What is avoidance of dangerous anthropogenic climate change? Dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate mean? What does DAI mean? How do you define that? That was back in 1992, and then over time we were able to give form to that, to give really concreteness to that, and translate that into temperature rise 2 degrees, ultimately 1.5. I think we could see a similar thing if we started articulating a goal around adaptation. At least start saying, even if we don't know exactly now how we would define it, start saying we need to have, we should be aiming to have 50% of the world be climate resilient, world populations be climate resilient by 2030 and 100% by 2050. What exactly does that mean? Well, let's go and set the goal and then figure out how we're going to measure it as we go. In the same way that we set out a really big goal on DAI for the climate and then figured out how to translate that, what that meant in temperature. So I think on adaptation, just similar to what we've said about tripling renewable goal and goals on finance and so on, I think we should start articulating goals on adaptation that could then be a North Star for other work. So on loss and damage, I think you said it in terms of in terms of the bright points and the bright spots so far, Helen. The operationalization of the fund on the first day, which of course took a lot of work in the lead in up to that, but having a real way forward on the loss and damage fund, the kind of pledges that we're seeing, maybe some expectations that it could be capitalized to the level of $1 billion by the end of COP28, if we can get there. So that's real money on the table. We've got some of the provisions we need in terms of operationalizing it. I think the key thing we see now is a need for is the need for making sure the money is well spent. And a big part of that will be coordination. There are mechanisms for coordination, the Santiago network in particular, but I think we really need to ensure that there's a joined up and coordinated approach so that efforts on loss and damage are moving in the same direction. We published a paper on that, informed by the convenings that C2ES does of heads of delegation. So that's around the coordination role of the UNFCCC. We see the UNFCCC as playing a critical role here in coordinating for loss and damage, and we've put some of those options up in that paper on the website. But I think that's where we see lots of progress on loss and damage, surprising amounts of progress, but it's going to be critical that that money is well spent so that we get more of it flowing, and we think coordination is the key.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Nat. And both addressing what we need on the global goal for adaptation and also some of the progress we've seen, but also what more we need to do on loss and damage. Kate, I actually want to pass back to you, if I can, again, quickly, just, to tell us what you think is needed. How do we actually increase and support communities in terms of adaptive capacity, in terms of building resilience?
Oh, thank you. I mean, I think it's important that you framed the question the way you did, because adaptation is obviously different from mitigation in being very much a local issue, a localized issue, and it has communities at its heart, therefore. So, for resilience, therefore, forward planning is key, and we need to have, adaptation and also resilience plans developed, not only at national level, but also at subnational level, and essentially right down to community level. So, that's something that has been happening to an extent over recent years, but I think there's a long way to go in terms of having the funding, the capacity, and generally the resources to really make that happen on the scale that we need. And when you're creating a plan, even if it's at a local level, or actually even especially at a local level, it needs a very wide range of stakeholder involvement and needs to have buy-in to balance the needs of different actors. In a community level, you're very likely to have to balance, for example, water needs between industry, agriculture, and population. And it's important that, the ways to address adaptation address the needs of the poorest and the most vulnerable in society, that they're not the ones who come to the end of the queue when it comes to who's protected. So, the question about this is very often who's protected and who pays. And then in terms of how we do that, well, some countries, as I've mentioned, they will benefit from capacity building and technical assistance to drive that approach. Obviously, there's a huge role there for multilateral development banks and other public banks who play an increasingly large role in adaptation finance, but also, some of the other things they do in terms of the technical support and the capacity building should not be overlooked. They have a lot of different roles beyond just passing money over. It's also worth noting, risk data, our actual understanding of what we need to adapt to is not that great. It's improving, but at the same time, I think the world is quickly realizing you only have to look at the weather events of the last year, to realize that the past does not predict the future. So, there are a huge amount of people out there with a lot of technical expertise who actually still are having difficulty saying what's going to happen next. What this actually means is that we need to plan for a high level of uncertainty around physical impacts. We can't wait around for the science to get better, because with our lack of understanding of climate feedbacks, etc., it probably never will to the extent where we can perfectly plan. We need to, plan for uncertainty. Mm-hmm. So I should mention at this point that E3G, together with IIED, coordinate the Climate and Development Ministerial for Adaptation Finance, which has conducted an evidence review and technical workshops for the last 2 years on adaptation finance. And the result of that work is a vision and action document, which will be signed here at COP on the 8th by a new coalition of ambition for adaptation finance, which sets up an ambitious agenda for adaptation finance reform and a set of actions that countries will undertake in the short and the long term and report back on next year. So you heard that here first. I just wanted to also just share a few more little Stern-Songway stats, because I'm slightly obsessed with the Stern-Songway statistics today. So they've said in their summary document that adaptation costs and needs are now estimated at around 10 to 18 times as much as current flows of international public adaptation finance. And that international public finance commitments for adaptation in emerging markets and developing economies fell by 15% in 2021. Furthermore, 66% of total bilateral adaptation finance committed to emerging markets and developing economies for the period 2017 to 21 was dispersed, compared with 98% for all bilateral development finance. So we've got some serious issues there around the financing. Apologies for coming back to financing, but it is my topic.
No, fair enough, and the gaps are huge. The gaps are really huge, but wonderful to hear also about what's happening with the coalition on ambition, on adaptation finance. So wonderful that you've been working on this, and now we're going forward. So hopefully those stats will change soon. Now, let's go to final topic briefly. An area that's long been very neglected in the climate space is agriculture, land use, food systems, the transformation we need to do there. And it's a critical part of how we need to tackle climate change, potentially up to 30% of the solution space, but one that hasn't been a big focus. Melanie, what do you think we're doing? How are we doing in terms of more productive, more resilient food systems? Tell us.
Well, thank you, Helen. And yeah, actually, this COP, it was very exciting to see the food declaration. I think it's the first time that food has really taken center stage. And I think a bit like Forest took center stage in Glasgow, we now won't have a COP without looking very seriously at food for the reasons that you've said, because it's actually such a significant part of the emissions, and it links so strongly to nature and people as well. So that's a really big outcome. But then what do we do about it after we've signed the declaration? WRI has done research on what are the main actions you can take on food, and you'll be pleased to know that it's presented as a menu with 5 courses, and actually every course has got several dishes, so I encourage you onto our website to see that. But to give you a taste of it, firstly, reducing the growth in demand for food and other agricultural products. So rather than make everyone eat less, this is about food loss and waste, as well as shifts in diets. Second, it's about increasing food production without expanding agricultural land. Third, it's about protecting and restoring natural ecosystems and limiting agricultural land shifting. Fourth, it's about increasing fish supply. You'll have to look at the dishes under there to see how you do that sustainably and well. And fifth, it's about reducing greenhouse gas emissions from agricultural production. With those actions, we're working as WRI with FOLU, a coalition, to work on the ground with a range of countries to help them develop their own national plans, because it's a menu. It'll depend on each country what's most important, and we're working in a couple of countries at the subnational level. So great to see it center stage. Really practical things we can do, and actually not rocket science.
Thank you, Melanie, and thanks for already teasing us. It's coming up to, dinner time, and we've got a 5-course menu of actions we can do on food. Perfect. Thank you. Marcin, let me pass back to you now. How do we do all of this, what Melanie described in terms of food and agricultural systems, while also reversing deforestation and avoiding further land use expansion?
Great, thank you so much. I think, like Melanie said, I think we have to have some paradigm shifts, right? This is something that is possible, but I think we need to look a little bit differently about it. So we obviously have to pay attention to siting in terms of this, very huge rollout of renewable energy that we need to deploy. And we need to think about repurposing lands that have been degraded. We also have to take a circularity type of mentality. I think we've all grown up in an era where we just extracted use and threw it away, right? This is part of our waste and food loss waste. We have to start thinking about how we use those resources and how we repurpose those resources, repurpose our land. Do not just extract and throw away. And it is really a different mentality for all of us, but I think that we can get there. In fact, I don't think we're going to be able to make our goals if we don't kind of really change that area. I also think we need to be more creative and innovative in terms of how we look at this new era of renewable energy and its impact on nature. I think in developed countries, we have a lot of data mapping where our renewable energy resources are and where some of our critical habitats are. So I think we have that information. And what I think we need to do is, instead of traditionally we've kind of looked at things on a project by project basis and said, no to that and no to that and yes to that. I think we have to flip that on its ahead. And from the conservation area, we need to borrow the idea of jurisdictional approaches, right? And so really being able to identify those go zones and having kind of consensus on those go zones, and then being able to do some of the environmental impact assessments on kind of that jurisdictional approach, so you don't have to do it project by project by project quite as much in order to accelerate. In the Global South, I don't think we have quite the data that we need to do, and so we need philanthropy and governments to start to fund some of that data on the impacts of this renewable energy transition on nature and people. We also need to do that in some burgeoning areas such as offshore wind. We don't really have, it's not well mapped in terms of those impacts, and also with our critical mineral mining. So really asking philanthropy and government to step up, working with NGOs to do some of that mapping. And then I think, as you know, has been said to everybody before, that in order to phase out of fossil fuels, we need to quickly scale renewables. So being able to do this in a way that doesn't repeat the same mistakes that we made in the fossil fuel era, we can do it better, we can do it quicker. We've got a lot of the technology and the assets and the data to accomplish that.
Thank you so much, Marcin, and thank you to this fabulous panel, and of course to Andrew, who spoke earlier. This has really been a very important and rich discussion. We've got the global stocktake here. It is the biggest accountability moment on what we've been doing together on climate action. This is huge. We need to use this as the input to how countries ramp up their ambition, their NDCs for 2025 going forward. We heard a lot of guidance from the panel here and from Andrew. I mean, we need to do systems transformation. We really need to work on the narrative. How do we show that this is the approach, that it's a growth, it's a jobs, it's a prosperity approach? And we need to do a lot more on combating disinformation. There's far too much out there, which is slowing us down. And then across the different areas, we looked at the energy transition, what we need to do to transform food and agricultural systems, building adaptation, resilience, and addressing loss and damage, and of course, all that we need to do on finance. There were 4 I's that came out, and I'm going to do this quickly so that we can finish it off. 1, implementation, successful implementation of what we've got now, showing the case and how we can actually move that forward, the benefits, and how we can do it. Integration, looking at climate with nature, with people. How do we actually do this in a way where all benefit? It cannot be a trade-off, one or the other. Incentives, a lot of discussion here. I mean, if we took this panel as an example, a lot of interest these days in carbon pricing. So carbon pricing and what we can do to really finally shift and phase out fossil fuel subsidies, far too large and going in exactly the wrong direction. So we need to get those incentives right. And the innovations, right? How can we actually keep innovating, taking approaches, whether it's finance or it's in the agriculture and food system or others, and scale them up in this systemic way. So let me stop there, and everyone, please, huge round of applause for our wonderful panel. Thank you.